The town had no name outsiders cared to remember. On maps, it was little more than a smudge along the northern coast, a scattering of rooftops pressed between cliffs and water. To those who lived there, however, names mattered little. The town was the sea, and the sea was the town. Everything else was detail. The ocean decided what kind of people they became. It hardened their skin, weathered their bones, and salted their blood. From the first cries of a newborn to the last breath of an old man, every life beat to the tide's rhythm. Infants were swaddled in blankets still damp from sea mist. Children cut their feet on barnacle-crusted rocks before they ever learned to walk properly on cobblestones. Boys grew into men with nets instead of toys, while girls learned to gut fish before they could play their own hair. No one escaped it, even those who hated the water. Rare souls who avoided the docks, still smelled it on their clothes, tasted it in their bread, and heard it sighing through their dreams. Morning began with gulls screaming overhead, sharp cries that pierced the silence before dawn. Men gathered on the docks with their boats, small and battered from years of storms. They spat into the water, a ritual as much as a habit, for everyone knew you gave something back before you asked for anything in return. A handful of grain, a splash of beer, even a whispered curse, it didn't matter what form the offering took. It was the gesture that counted. Women watched from doorways, arms crossed against the chill, their eyes narrowing as their husbands and sons shoved off from shore. Each departure was both routine and a gamble. A good day meant nets heavy with cod and mackerel, barrels filled, bellies fed. A bad day meant empty hands and debts. A truly bad day meant the sea claimed someone and gave nothing back. The sea was generous, yes, but it was also merciless. That duality shaped the town's customs. When boats returned at dusk, the villagers lined the shore to count them, lips pressed tight until the last vessel slipped past the breakwater. Only then did conversation begin, sometimes loud with relief, sometimes hushed with grief. If a boat was missing, lanterns burned through the night in windows facing the water, so the dead could find their way home, or so people hoped. Children grew up half afraid, half enchanted by it all. They skipped stones across tide pools, daring each other to wade out further than they should. They clutched at each other's sleeves during storms, eyes wide as thunder rattled the cliffs. They learned early that the sea could not be defied. You could fish it, you could pray to it, you could curse it, but you could never own it. The market, too, bore the mark of the water. Stalls overflowed with salted herring, dried kelp, and baskets of mussels. Fish scales glittered in the dust like lost coins. Even the blacksmith measured his work by the harbor's pulse, mending anchors, sharpening harpoons, forging hooks. Every trade looped back to the ocean, as if the town itself had been netted and dragged into its depths. And with all this came superstition. Men never whistled at sea, for fear it would summon winds too strong for their sails. Women tied red threads around their children's wrists, believing it would keep them from drowning. Some families refused to eat certain fish, calling them brothers of men who once drowned. Others poured the first sip of every drink into the waves, so no one at the table would be taken next. These rituals were not written, not even spoken of openly, but they lived in every gesture, every pause. Outsiders who visited, rare though they were, often laughed at the odd little habits. Yet for the townsfolk, they were not oddities at all. They were survival. The sea gave, the sea took, and somewhere between those two truths, life carried on. Still, the town was never fully at peace with its watery master. Fear simmered beneath the surface, like the tension before a storm. People knew the ocean's moods the way others knew the seasons, the sudden churn of waves that warned of tempests, the eerie stillness before a squall, the soft pull of tides that promised abundance. But knowing did not mean control. Control was an illusion the town had long since surrendered. On storm nights, when lightning split the sky and thunder rolled through the cliffs, every door was bolted tight. Families huddled together, whispering prayers while the roofs shuddered. Some claimed to hear voices in the howling wind, not human voices but something older, deeper, laughter, wailing, or songs too strange to belong to any tongue. The next morning, they would find the shore littered with broken planks, sometimes from their own boats, sometimes from ships no one recognized. And sometimes, washed ashore with the wreckage, a body. It was during these mornings of wreck and ruin that the whispers grew loudest. Children were told to stay indoors, but they pressed their faces to windows and saw the elders walking the beach, their heads bowed, muttering words the young did not understand. Small charms were buried in the sand, bones thrown back into the surf, candles lit in hollows of the rocks. The sea was not just water. It was hunger, it was memory, it was the pulse of everything they knew. And deep down, whether they admitted it or not, every single villager believed the same thing. The sea was alive. The morning began with a hush that unsettled even the most weathered men of the harbor. Normally, dawn at the docks was a chorus of clattering wooden crates, men shouting over gulls, and the groan of boats tugging against their ropes. But that day, silence hung in the salt-drenched air, as if the sea itself was holding its breath. Fishermen moved slowly, muttering to one another, their eyes darting toward the horizon. The tide was unusually low, bearing slick rocks and tide pools that glittered faintly in the pale light. Clouds draped the sky, heavy and unmoving, yet no wind stirred. Strange weather, old Fedor grumbled as he tightened the ropes on his skiff. His face was a map of creases carved by sun and sea, his beard stiff with salt. He spat into the water as if to challenge it. The sea's thinking about something. His nephew, Mikhail, younger and sharper, tried to laugh but failed. Or maybe she's sleeping. He forced a grin, though his eyes betrayed unease. 3 boats pushed off that morning, oars dipping reluctantly into the still water. As the shoreline receded, the world grew muted, the town fading into a smear of gray stone and smoke. Beyond the breakwater, mist thickened, curling low over the surface, swallowing sound and sight alike. It was in that eerie silence that the first man noticed. "Something's there," whispered Ivan, pointing toward a ripple slicing through the water. At first, they thought it a dolphin, sleek, fast, purposeful. But dolphins had not been seen in those waters for years. The ripple curved closer, circling the boats with deliberate grace. The men leaned over the sides, peering into the pale veil of fog. And then she rose. A slender figure broke the surface, moving with effortless strength. Water slid down hair that glimmered like threads of silver and seafoam. Her skin caught the weak light, glowing faintly as though lit from within. The men gasped. Some cursed, some crossed themselves. Her eyes were the most unsettling of all. Deep, shifting blues and greens, as if the sea itself had taken shape within them. Jessica Dolphin. She did not speak, yet her gaze carried words heavier than storms. For a heartbeat, the fisherman forgot to breathe. She swam closer, no fear in her movements, her smile both inviting and sorrowful, like the tide that lures and devours. Mikhail gripped the side of the boat so tightly his knuckles whitened. It's a woman," he stammered. Fedor's jaw clenched. "No, not a woman. Something else." The figure circled once more, her motions fluid, impossibly fast, as if she belonged to a world beyond theirs. She dove beneath the keel, the water shimmering in her wake. The men staggered as the boat rocked, then steadied. They leaned over, but she was gone. Just as they began to murmur, she surfaced again, this time farther out, her body arching like a dancer, water spraying around her in a halo of light. The fog thinned for a moment, and they saw her clearly. Not a trick of light, not a hallucination born of weariness, but real, flesh and blood, yet otherworldly. She raised one hand, delicate, dripping, toward them, not in greeting, but in a gesture that felt like a warning. Then, with a final look, she slipped beneath the waves, vanishing into the endless deep. The silence afterward was unbearable. The only sound was the nervous creak of boats shifting on the still water. Ivan finally whispered, "We saw her. By God, we saw her." "No," Fedor barked, though his voice cracked. "We saw nothing. Tell the town nothing. The sea plays tricks. That's all." But his hand trembled as he reached for the net. The younger men exchanged glances. Each knew what they had seen, yet none wished to be the first to name it aloud. Legends were dangerous things in a town built on the mercy of the sea. To believe meant surrender, to deny meant blindness. When they returned to shore, their catch was almost nothing, nets empty, hooks bare. Yet none of them spoke of the poor fishing. Their eyes wandered to the horizon, searching, fearing, longing. By nightfall, the whispers had begun. Children claimed to see shapes in the surf, women swore they heard laughter in the waves. The men said nothing, but their silence was louder than any tale. JASICA Dolphin had returned, and with her came a change the town could neither understand nor ignore. In the little seaside town, the sea was not simply water. It was a neighbor, a master, a thief, and sometimes, a grave. To live there meant to live in constant conversation with the waves, even if that conversation was only silence. The people had grown hard around its edges. Their hands were calloused from rope and oar, their backs bent from years of hauling nets heavy with fish or, just as often, heavy with nothing at all. They mended their roofs with driftwood, patched sails with old clothes, and measured time not by the church bells but by the tides. Yet beneath their practical labor, stories pulsed like an undercurrent. They were told in hushed voices by the hearth when storms raged outside, or whispered by mothers to restless children when the wind rattled shutters. These were not stories to amuse, they were warnings, memories, fragments of something half-believed. The oldest tale spoke of the ocean's daughter, a being said to appear when the balance between people and the sea was broken. Some said she was a spirit sent to judge the living. Others swore she was born of a drowned woman's final breath, shaped into flesh by the waves. The gentler version painted her as a guardian, watching over those who respected the ocean's gift. The darker version cast her as a herald of storms, drawing whole fleets into the abyss. The truth, no one knew, but the name lingered on their tongues like salt, Morskaya Dok, the daughter of the sea. Old Fedor remembered sitting at his grandmother's knee, her voice low and steady as she spoke of the figure with eyes, like the deep trench, where no son dares to go. He had laughed as a boy, but as a man, when storms ripped nets apart and pulled comrades into the black water, the laughter soured into unease. At the tavern, the men sometimes argued about it over mugs of sour ale. Stories for children, scoffed Yaroslav, a broad-shouldered net maker who prided himself on reason. Waves take men because they are careless. That's all. But others disagreed. Then why, countered Ivan, did my uncle swear he saw her before the great storm of '72? He said she swam beside his boat, smiled, and then the skies broke open. He drowned, and so did 3 more. Coincidence? Maybe. But the sea does not waste smiles. Arguments usually ended in silence, not agreement. In the end, no one wanted to admit aloud that the sea might have a face. The children, however, clung to the stories most fiercely. In the long summer evenings, they would gather by the tide pools, daring one another to dip a hand into the water and whisper, "Daughter, are you there?" Then they would shriek and scatter if the waves foamed too close. They told each other that if you listened closely at night, you could hear her laughter mingling with the crash of the tide. Women of the town, too, had their own quiet reverence. They tied bits of ribbon to the posts along the harbor, small offerings that fluttered in the sea breeze. Some believed the ocean's daughter envied them their children, and so they left these gifts to appease her, to distract her from envy's sharp hand. The church frowned on such practices, of course. Father Andrei scolded his flock from the pulpit, declaring that the only guardian was God. Yet even he, when he walked home alone at night, would quicken his steps if he heard the surf roar louder than usual. It was the contradictions that made the myth enduring. The ocean's daughter was feared and loved, doubted and believed, scorned and secretly honored. She was as changeable as the tides themselves. And so, when the fishermen whispered of a figure in the mist, the town stirred uneasily. The old ones pursed their lips and muttered prayers. The young laughed nervously, unwilling to admit that their hearts beat faster. Mothers held their children a little tighter, and the tavern filled with cautious, sidelong glances. Something had shifted. The sea had moved closer, pressing its ancient story into their bones. No one dared say her name aloud just yet. But in their hearts, they all knew. The ocean's daughter had returned.